On a cold December morning, New York City was blanketed in a thin layer of frost. The streets were bustling, but the icy wind that whipped through the corners made the city feel even colder. James, a middle-aged millionaire, was hurrying to an important business meeting, his mind completely absorbed in the numbers and deals he needed to discuss. Known for his determination, James was a man who, despite his wealth, always wore a serious expression, as if he carried an invisible burden. As he crossed one of the busy intersections downtown, something caught his eye. A young girl, frail and wearing visibly worn-out clothes, sat on the sidewalk, holding a small plastic cup. Her large eyes, though dull, watched the passers-by with a mix of desperation and resignation. James, who rarely paid attention to those around him, felt a strange tightness in his chest as he noticed the girl. He tried to look away, but something about the scene held him. He slowed his pace, and in an impulse he couldn't quite explain, he stopped in front of her. "Hi," James began, his voice coming out softer than he expected. "What's your name?" The girl raised her eyes cautiously, hesitating before she answered. "Lily, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the city. James felt a wave of compassion that he couldn't quite understand. He wasn't the kind of man to be swayed by emotions. His business, his entire life, had always been guided by reason and control. But here, on this freezing morning, something shifted. "What are you doing here, Lily?" he asked, knowing the answer would be as harsh as the weather around them. "I'm cold and hungry," she replied, looking down as if ashamed to admit it. James found himself unable to move for a few seconds. There was something in Lily's fragility that reminded him of something he had tried to forget a long time ago. Without thinking twice, he crouched down beside her. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. "Let's get you somewhere warm, and I'll get you something to eat." Lily hesitated. She was used to empty promises, but there was something in James' voice that made her trust him. Slowly, she took his hand, and he gently helped her to her feet. As they walked through the streets, James couldn't stop thinking about why he was doing this. He, a man so busy, was putting aside all his commitments to help a stranger. But as he looked at Lily, he knew that something much bigger than his daily routine was at play. They arrived at James' luxurious apartment, a modern and spacious place that he had always found cold and empty. When Lily entered, her eyes widened at the size of the place. James led her to the living room, where he turned on the heater and wrapped her in a soft blanket. "Sit down, I'll get you something to eat," he said, heading to the kitchen. As he prepared a simple meal, James felt a stirring inside him that he couldn't explain. The presence of this girl, so vulnerable, seemed to bring up memories he had buried deep. When he returned to the living room, he found Lily curled up in the blanket, staring out the window with a distant expression. "Here you go," he said, handing her the plate. "Eat slowly, you're safe now." Lily took the plate with trembling hands and began to eat, clearly starving. James sat down in a nearby chair, watching her in silence. He wanted to know more about her, to understand how such a young girl had ended up in this situation. "Where are your parents, Lily?" he asked, trying to be as gentle as possible. Lily paused for a moment, her eyes welling up with tears before she looked away. "My dad. He left me here in the city. He and my mom had a big fight, and he just abandoned me." Her voice broke, and she clutched the blanket tighter, as if trying to shield herself from the pain. James felt a pang in his heart. Lily's words echoed in his mind, bringing back memories of a childhood he preferred to forget. He looked at her, seeing himself reflected in her vulnerability. "You're not alone anymore, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to help you." What James didn't know was that this simple act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The warmth of James' apartment gradually seeped into Lily's cold bones, and as she finished the last bite of her meal, she seemed to relax for the first time since they had met. James watched her closely, noticing the subtle shifts in her demeanor. There was something deeply troubling in her eyes, a sadness that didn't belong in someone so young. "Do you feel better now?" James asked gently, not wanting to push her too hard, too soon. Lily nodded, though her eyes were still downcast. "Yes, sir. Thank you for everything." James felt a pang of discomfort at the formal tone she used. It was as if she were trying to keep a barrier between them, a wall that protected her from the harsh realities she had faced. He leaned forward slightly, trying to make his voice as soothing as possible. "You don't have to call me sir, Lily. My name is James, and you can talk to me. I'm here to help." Lily hesitated, her small hands gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. It was clear that she was struggling with whether to open up or keep her pain hidden. Finally, after a long silence, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "It's been really hard since my dad left," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "He and my mom fought all the time. I didn't understand everything they argued about, but I knew it was bad. One night, they had a really big fight. I heard my mom crying, and then he just left. He took me with him, but after a few days in the city, he just left me here." James' heart clenched as he listened to her story. The abandonment, the fear. He could hear it all in her trembling voice. He knew what it was like to feel helpless, to be at the mercy of someone else's decisions. Memories of his own childhood, of his father's harsh words and unyielding expectations, began to surface. He pushed them aside, focusing instead on Lily. "And your mom?" he asked carefully. Lily shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know where she is. My dad wouldn't let me talk to her. He said she didn't care about me anymore. But I don't believe him. I don't want to believe him." James leaned back, trying to process everything she was telling him. The situation was far worse than he had imagined. This wasn't just a case of a lost child. Lily had been torn apart by the very people who were supposed to protect her. "I'm so sorry, Lily," he said softly. "No one should have to go through what you've been through." Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, sniffling quietly. "It's not your fault. You've been so kind to me. I don't know why you're helping me, but thank you." James smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. "I'm helping you because you deserve it, Lily. You deserve to be safe, to be cared for. And I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're okay." For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heater. Lily looked at James, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine if she could truly trust him. Whatever she saw seemed to reassure her, because she finally nodded, a small, hopeful smile breaking through her tears. "Okay," she whispered. James felt a surge of emotion, something between relief and determination. He had made a promise to Lily, and he intended to keep it. But as he sat there, watching her curl up on the couch, a new thought began to take root in his mind. He couldn't just help Lily in the short term. He needed to find her mother, to understand what had really happened between her parents. Only then could he offer Lily the true safety and stability she needed. But as much as the idea made sense, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something far more complicated and painful than he had anticipated. Still, he knew he couldn't back down now. He had already been drawn into Lily's world, and there was no turning back. "Lily," he said gently, breaking the silence, "I'm going to help you find your mom. We'll figure this out together, okay?" Lily's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and hope crossing her face. "Do you really think we can find her?" James nodded, his voice firm. "I do, and I won't stop until we do." As he spoke, James felt a strange sense of resolve settle over him. This was no longer just about helping a young girl in need. It was about confronting the ghosts of his own past, about finding a way to heal the wounds that had long festered inside him. And in helping Lily, he might just find a way to help himself. The night settled over New York City, its usual energy dimming as the streets grew quieter. In James' apartment, the atmosphere was different. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, her small frame curled up under the blanket. Her breathing was steady, but even in sleep, her face held a trace of sadness that tugged at James' heart. James watched her for a moment, his mind spinning with the weight of her story. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation was deeply familiar, something that resonated with his own life. As he sat down in the armchair across from Lily, memories he had long buried began to resurface, unbidden and unwanted. He closed his eyes, trying to push them away, but it was no use. The past had a way of creeping back in, especially when he least expected it. In his mind, He was suddenly back in his childhood home, a grand estate that should have been a place of comfort but was anything but. The halls were long and cold, filled with echoes of voices that never seemed to speak of anything good. His father, a stern and domineering man, loomed large in every room, his presence suffocating even when he wasn't there. James remembered the constant pressure, the relentless criticism. Nothing he did was ever good enough. If he brought home an A on his report card, his father would ask why it wasn't an A+. If he excelled in sports, his father would remind him that there was always someone better. It wasn't love that drove his father. It was control. Control over every aspect of James' life, molding him into the image of perfection that his father had in mind. "Don't disappoint me, James," his father's voice echoed in his memory, harsh and unforgiving. "You have to be the best. Anything less is a failure." James opened his eyes, his chest tight with the old, familiar anxiety. Even now, after all these years, his father's words still had the power to wound him. He had spent his entire life trying to escape that man's shadow, building his own empire, his own wealth, just to prove that he could do it on his own. But the success had come at a cost that he was only now beginning to realize. He looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully, and wondered if she had felt the same way. Had she been constantly judged, always made to feel like she wasn't enough? Had her parents, the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally, failed her in the same way James' father had failed him? The thought made him angry. Angry at the world, at the injustices that children like Lily had to endure. But it also made him determined. He couldn't change his own past, but he could do something about Lily's future. He could be the person who finally stood up for her, who finally said, "You are enough, just as you are." As the hours passed, James found himself pacing the room, the memories of his childhood mixing with the present. He remembered the arguments with his father, the times he had wanted to stand up for himself but hadn't had the courage, the times he had been too scared to speak his mind, too afraid of the consequences. He remembered one night in particular, a night that had haunted him for years. He had been 12 years old, sitting at the dinner table with his parents. His father was going on about the family business, about how James would one day take over and how he had to be prepared to make sacrifices. James had been listening in silence, as usual, until his father had said something that had made him snap. "You have to be ruthless in this world, James," his father had said. "Compassion is a weakness. If you want to succeed, you can't let your emotions get in the way." James had looked up then, something inside him breaking. "But what if I don't want to be like you?" he had blurted out, his voice shaking with fear and defiance. The room had fallen silent. His father had stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he had set down his fork and knife, folding his hands neatly on the table. "Excuse me," his father had said, his voice dangerously calm. James had known then that he had made a mistake, but he couldn't take it back. He had stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't want to be ruthless," he had said, quieter now, but still firm. "I don't want to hurt people just to get what I want." For a moment, his father had said nothing. Then, with a cold smile, he had leaned back in his chair. "You're weak, James," he had said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "And that's why you'll never be good enough." Those words had stayed with James his entire life, shaping every decision he had ever made. He had vowed never to be weak, never to let anyone see the cracks in his armor. But now, as he looked at Lily, he realized that in protecting himself, he had also built walls around his heart, walls that had kept everyone out, including himself. He took a deep breath, the weight of the memories pressing down on him. But instead of pushing them away, he let them settle. He needed to remember. He needed to face his past if he was going to help Lily with hers. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, James made a decision. He would find Lily's mother, yes, but more than that, he would confront his own demons, his own unresolved pain. For too long, he had let the past control him. It was time to take control back. He walked over to the couch, gently covering Lily with the blanket that had slipped off. As he did, she stirred slightly, murmuring something in her sleep. James watched her for a moment longer, feeling a strange mix of emotions: sadness, hope, determination. "Sleep well, Lily," he whispered. "Things are going to get better. I promise." As he turned away, ready to face the challenges ahead, he couldn't help but wonder if, in helping Lily, he might finally find the peace he had been searching for all his life. The early morning sun bathed New York City in a soft, golden light, but James barely noticed as he moved through the quiet streets. His thoughts were fixed on the task ahead: finding Lily's mother. He had spent the morning making calls, using all the connections he had amassed over the years to track down any information about Sarah, the woman who had once been a part of his distant past. It felt strange, revisiting those old memories, but James knew he had no choice. Lily's future depended on it. James' search had taken him to a small, run-down neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The buildings were old, the paint peeling from the walls, and the streets were filled with the quiet hum of a community that had seen better days. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, a creeping worry that he was about to uncover something that had been better left buried. He arrived at the address he had been given, a modest, aging apartment building with rusted fire escapes and dirty windows. James paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath. He had faced down corporate giants, made billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but this felt different. This felt personal. With a sense of determination, he pushed open the door and made his way up the creaking stairs to the second floor. He found the door he was looking for, apartment 2B. It was slightly ajar, and James hesitated before knocking softly. "Sarah," he called out, his voice echoing in the narrow hallway. "Sarah, are you there?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door opened a bit wider, revealing a woman who looked as though she had been through hell and back. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes worn, and there was a deep sadness in her eyes that seemed to have settled there long ago. "James?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and confusion. What are you doing here?" James took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't seen Sarah in years, not since they had parted ways after high school. But despite the time that had passed, there was no mistaking her. She was the same girl he had once loved, though time had clearly not been kind to her. "I'm here about Lily," James said, his voice gentle but firm. "She's in trouble, Sarah. She needs you." At the mention of Lily's name, Sarah's eyes widened, and a flicker of fear crossed her face. She opened the door fully, motioning for James to come inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, with only the bare essentials. It was clear that Sarah had been living a hard life, scraping by however she could. James could see the exhaustion in her posture, the weight of years of struggle etched into her every movement. She's okay?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she closed the door behind James. I thought she was with her father." James nodded, but his expression was serious. "She was, but he abandoned her, Sarah, left her on the streets with nothing. I found her yesterday. She was begging for food. She needs you, Sarah. She needs her mother." Sarah sank into a chair, her face pale and stricken with guilt. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know he would do that. I thought he would take care of her, at least, but I should have known better." James watched her carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. He could see the pain in her eyes, the regret that seemed to hang over her like a shadow. But there was something else, too, something that gave him hope. "Sarah," he said quietly, taking a seat across from her, "I know things have been hard for you, but Lily needs you now more than ever. She's been through so much, and she's scared. She needs to know that she's not alone, that she still has someone who loves her." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "I've made so many mistakes, James," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was doing what was best for her, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." James reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "It's not too late, Sarah. You can still be there for her. We can find a way to make this right." For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. She just sat there, staring at their hands, lost in thought. Then, slowly, she nodded. "You're right," she whispered. "I have to do this. For Lily." James felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't going to be easy, Nothing about this situation was, but at least now he knew that Sarah was willing to try. And that was a start. "I'll take you to her," James said, standing up. "She's at my apartment. She's safe, but she's been through a lot. Seeing you will mean the world to her." Sarah stood as well, though her movements were hesitant, almost as if she were afraid of what was to come. I don't know if she'll want to see me," she said softly. "After everything that's happened." "She will," James assured her, his voice firm. "She's your daughter, Sarah. She needs you, more than anything." As they left the apartment and made their way back to James' car, Sarah remained quiet, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. James didn't push her to talk. He knew that this was going to be overwhelming for her, and he wanted to give her the space to process everything. The drive back to James' apartment was filled with a tense silence, but James could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on both of them. As they neared their destination, he glanced over at Sarah, noticing the way her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. "Sarah," he said gently, pulling up in front of the building, "you can do this. Lily needs to see that you're here for her." Sarah took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "I know," she murmured. I'm scared, James. I don't want to let her down again." "You won't," James said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "You're here now, and that's what matters." They stepped out of the car and made their way up to the apartment. With each step, James could feel the tension rising, but he knew they were doing the right thing. He opened the door, leading Sarah inside. Lily was sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the television, though it was clear she wasn't really watching. When she heard the door open, she turned, her eyes widening as she saw Sarah standing in the doorway. "Mom." Lily's voice was small, uncertain, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Sarah took a tentative step forward, her voice trembling. "It's me, sweetheart. I'm here." For a moment, Lily just stared at her, as if trying to make sense of the situation. Then, without warning, she jumped up from the couch and ran into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah held her tightly, her own tears falling freely as she whispered words of comfort into her daughter's hair. James watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with emotion. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey for both of them, but in that moment, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. The apartment was filled with the soft sounds of Sarah comforting Lily, their whispered words of reassurance blending into the quiet hum of the city outside. James stood a few steps away, giving them space, but he couldn't help the swirl of emotions inside him. Seeing Lily clinging to her mother, tears streaming down her face, brought up feelings he hadn't expected, emotions that were both foreign and familiar, all at once. As the minutes passed, Sarah gently led Lily back to the couch, the two of them sitting close together, their hands tightly clasped. James remained near the doorway, watching the scene unfold, his mind racing. He had come here to help Lily reunite with her mother, but now, something deeper was gnawing at him, something that didn't quite make sense. Lily looked up at Sarah, her voice still trembling. "Mom, why did Dad leave me? What did I do wrong?" Sarah's face crumpled with pain, and she shook her head, pulling Lily closer. "Oh, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Your father, he just made a terrible mistake. None of this is your fault." James felt a sharp pang in his chest as he listened. He had always prided himself on being able to remain detached, on being able to compartmentalize his emotions. But now, he was struggling to keep his composure. Something about the way Sarah spoke, the way she looked at Lily, it was as if there was something she wasn't saying, something she was holding back. As if sensing James' thoughts, Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something he couldn't quite read. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before she spoke again, her voice low and uncertain. "James, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." The room seemed to grow even quieter, the weight of her words hanging in the air. James' heart began to pound in his chest, his mind racing through all the possibilities. He could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, the way she gripped Lily's hand as if drawing strength from her. "What is it, Sarah?" he asked, his voice steady, though inside he felt anything but. Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze flickering between James and Lily. James, Lily's father isn't who you think he is. He's not some random man I met after high school. He's you. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. James stared at Sarah, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. He felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him, as if everything he thought he knew had suddenly been turned upside down. I'm Lily's father? The words came out in a whisper, as if saying them aloud would make them real. Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Yes, James, she's your daughter. I found out I was pregnant a few months after we reconnected that one night. But by then, you had already left for college and I didn't know how to tell you, so I didn't. James felt a rush of emotions, shock, disbelief, anger, and something else, something powerful and overwhelming that he couldn't quite name. He turned to look at Lily, who was staring up at him with wide, confused eyes. Dad? Lily's voice was small, trembling with uncertainty. James took a step closer, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Lily, I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. You're really my dad? James knelt down in front of her, his hands trembling as he reached out to gently take her hands in his. Yes, Lily, I'm your dad. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Lily stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to see the truth in his words. Then, slowly, she leaned forward, wrapping her small arms around his neck. James felt his heart swell as he hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of her tiny body against his. For the first time in his life, James felt something he had never felt before. An overwhelming, unconditional love that took his breath away. This was his daughter, his flesh and blood, and the thought of her going through so much pain broke something deep inside him. Sarah watched them, her face streaked with tears, but there was a hint of relief in her eyes. She had carried this secret for so long, and now, finally, it was out in the open. I'm so sorry, James, Sarah said softly. I should have told you sooner, but I was scared. I didn't know how you would react, and then things got so complicated with Lily's father, the man she thought was her father. James looked up at her, still holding Lily close. I understand, Sarah, but now that I know, things are going to change. I'm going to be here for her, for both of you. We'll figure this out together. Lily pulled back slightly, looking at James with wide, tear-filled eyes. Are you really going to stay, Dad? You won't leave me like he did? James' heart broke at the fear in her voice, at the thought that she could even doubt him. He placed a gentle hand on her cheek, his voice steady and full of conviction. I'm not going anywhere, Lily. I promise you that. You're my daughter, and I'm going to be here for you, no matter what. Lily's face crumpled as she began to cry again, but this time, her tears were mixed with relief. James held her close, feeling the weight of his new reality settling over him. He was a father to this beautiful, brave little girl who had been through so much. As the three of them sat together in the quiet apartment, James knew that his life had changed forever. He had spent years building his fortune, amassing wealth and power, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the small, fragile family in front of him, the daughter he had never known, and the woman who had once been the love of his life. James took a deep breath, his mind already racing with thoughts of the future. There were so many things to consider, so many challenges to face, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose, a reason to fight, to protect, to love. He looked at Sarah, who gave him a small, hopeful smile through her tears, and then at Lily, who was still clinging to him as if afraid he might disappear. James knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he was ready to face it, to face anything, as long as they were together. We're going to be okay, James said softly, his voice filled with determination. We're a family now, and nothing is going to change that. Lily nodded against his chest, her small hands clutching his shirt. I love you, Dad, she whispered. James felt tears prick his eyes as he hugged her even tighter. I love you too, Lily, more than anything. As they sat there, holding each other close. James couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something new, something better. He had lost so much in his life, but now he had found something that he never even knew he was missing, and he wasn't going to let it go. The revelation of his fatherhood had shaken James to his core, but it had also ignited something within him, a fierce determination to protect Lily and Sarah, to make up for the lost years. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions, as James tried to adjust to the reality of being a father. But as he began to settle into this new role, there was one lingering issue that he couldn't ignore: his own father. James knew that if he was going to move forward and be the father Lily needed, he had to confront the man who had shaped so much of his life, the man whose harsh words and unforgiving expectations still echoed in his mind. It was a confrontation he had avoided for years, but now it was unavoidable. He needed to break free from the grip his father had on him. It was a cold afternoon when James finally decided to make the call. He had been pacing the length of his living room, the phone in his hand, debating whether or not he was ready to face his father after all these years. Sarah and Lily were in the next room, playing a board game they had found in one of the apartment's closets. Their laughter, light and joyful, drifted through the closed door, a stark contrast to the tension building inside James. With a deep breath, he dialed the number. It rang only once before a familiar, stern voice answered. "James," his father said, his tone as cold and commanding as ever. "It's been a long time." James clenched his jaw, struggling to keep his voice steady. "It has," he replied, his heart pounding. "We need to talk. In person." There was a brief silence on the other end, and James could almost imagine his father's calculating expression, wondering what had prompted this unexpected call. "Very well," his father finally said. "Come by the house tomorrow afternoon." James agreed, the tension in his chest tightening as he hung up the phone. He hadn't been to his father's house in years, not since he had walked away from that life, determined to forge his own path. The thought of returning now, of facing the man who had haunted his thoughts for so long, filled him with a mixture of dread and resolve. The next day, James drove to the old family estate, the place where he had grown up. The drive was long and filled with memories. Memories of a childhood dominated by expectations, of a young boy who had been taught that emotions were weaknesses and that success was the only measure of worth. The estate was just as he remembered it, grand and imposing, with sprawling gardens that had always felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. As he pulled up to the front entrance, James took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. His father was waiting in the study, a room that had always been filled with the smell of old leather and cigar smoke. The moment James stepped inside, he felt the familiar weight of the past settle over him. His father was seated behind the large oak desk, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. "James," his father said, not bothering to rise from his chair. "What brings you back after all this time?" James closed the door behind him, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I'm not here to make small talk," he said, his voice firm. "I'm here because there are things we need to address, things that have been left unresolved for far too long." His father raised an eyebrow, but there was a hint of amusement in his eyes, as if he found James' defiance entertaining. "Oh, and what would those be?" James took a step forward, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The way you treated me, the way you controlled every aspect of my life. I spent my entire childhood trying to live up to your impossible standards, and no matter what I did, it was never enough." His father's expression remained calm, almost indifferent, as if he had heard this all before. "I pushed you because I knew you had potential, James. I wanted to make sure you didn't waste it. Look at you now, a successful man, a millionaire. I'd say my methods worked." "Your methods?" James nearly spat the words. "You turned me into a shell of a person. I spent my whole life trying to prove myself to you, trying to be the person you wanted me to be. But in the process, I lost who I really was." His father finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he walked around the desk to stand in front of James. "Is that what you think? That I did all of this to break you? You're stronger because of it. You learned to be ruthless, to prioritize success over sentiment. That's how you survived in this world. James shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Survived? I barely lived. I shut myself off from everyone, afraid to show any weakness, afraid that if I let anyone in, they'd see that I wasn't the perfect son you demanded I be. His father's eyes narrowed, the first sign of emotion breaking through his stoic exterior. And what are you now, James? Some sentimental fool who thinks emotions are going to get him ahead in life? Is that what this is about? This isn't about business or success, James said, his voice rising with frustration. This is about family, about what it means to actually care about someone, to protect them, not just because they're an asset, but because they're a part of you. I have a daughter, and I'm not going to make the same mistakes with her that you made with me. His father's expression faltered, just for a moment, as if the mention of a grandchild had caught him off guard. A daughter? He asked, his voice softer now, but still edged with skepticism. Yes, a daughter, James said, his tone firm. And she's everything to me. I'm not going to raise her the way you raised me, constantly afraid that I'm not enough. I'm going to be there for her, to show her that she's loved and valued for who she is, not just for what she can achieve. His father stared at him for a long moment, the tension between them thick and heavy. Then, slowly, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. It was the first time James had ever seen him show any sign of defeat. I suppose I've made mistakes, his father admitted, his voice low. I did what I thought was right, what I thought would make you strong. But perhaps I was wrong. James was stunned by the admission, by the fact that his father was even capable of admitting fault. For so long, he had seen this man as unyielding, unrepentant. But now, in the face of his own son's determination, he seemed almost human. I don't need your apologies, James said, his voice softening, but I do need you to understand that things are different now. I'm not that scared little boy anymore. I'm a father, and I'm going to do things my way. His father nodded slowly, a faint, sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You've grown, James. You've become your own man. I suppose that's all I ever wanted. For the first time in his life, James felt a sense of closure, a sense that the power his father had held over him was finally slipping away. He wasn't the man his father had tried to mold him into, and that was okay. He was something else, something better. A father who would protect his daughter with everything he had. Without another word, James turned and walked out of the study, the weight on his shoulders feeling lighter with every step. He had confronted his past, faced the man who had shaped so much of his life, and now he was free to move forward. As he drove back to his apartment, back to Lily and Sarah, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he needed to do, and now he could focus on what truly mattered, the future he was going to build with his daughter and the woman he had once loved. When he walked through the door of his apartment, Lily was the first to greet him, her face lighting up with joy as she ran into his arms. James lifted her up, holding her close, and for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. We're going to be okay, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. We're going to be just fine. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The days following the confrontation with Lily's former guardian were filled with a tense, uneasy calm. James couldn't shake the feeling that the man's departure was only a temporary reprieve, a lull before the storm. His words, "You haven't seen the last of me," echoed in James' mind, a constant reminder that the threat was still looming. But rather than succumbing to fear, James used it to fuel his resolve. He would do whatever it took to protect Lily and Sarah. James spent the next few days quietly strengthening the security around their home. He installed new locks on the doors, added security cameras, and even reached out to a lawyer to start the process of obtaining a restraining order. He didn't want to take any chances. Every night, he would double-check that the windows were locked and the alarm system was set before finally allowing himself to relax. But it wasn't just the physical security that concerned James. He knew that Lily's emotional well-being was just as important. The confrontation had shaken her, bringing back old fears she had just begun to leave behind. She was quieter than usual, her bright, playful energy dimmed by the uncertainty that had crept back into her life. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, James decided to address the issue head-on. Lily was sitting on the couch, curled up with a book, but her attention was elsewhere, her eyes distant. James sat down beside her, his heart aching at the sight of her so subdued. "Hey, Lily," he said gently, trying to catch her eye. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" Lily glanced up at him, her expression hesitant. She closed her book and leaned into him, seeking the comfort of his presence. "Is he really gone, Dad? Is he going to come back?" James wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "He's gone, sweetheart, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure he doesn't come near us again. I promise you, you're safe here." Lily nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fully fade. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he tries to take me away?" James felt a surge of anger at the thought, but he kept his voice calm and reassuring. "That's not going to happen. I won't let him, and neither will your mom. We're going to protect you, Lily, no matter what." Sarah, who had been quietly listening from the kitchen, joined them on the couch, wrapping her arms around both James and Lily. "We're in this together," she said softly, her voice filled with love. "We're a family now, and we're going to stay together. No one is going to take you away from us." Lily looked between them, her eyes searching their faces for reassurance. Seeing the determination and love in their expressions, she seemed to relax a little, the tension in her small body easing. "Okay," she whispered, leaning into them. "I believe you." They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them huddled together on the couch, finding strength in each other's presence. James felt a deep sense of protectiveness swell within him. This was his family, and he would do anything to keep them safe. The next morning, James took another step to ensure their safety. He met with the lawyer, who assured him that the restraining order would be processed as quickly as possible. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was another layer of protection, another way to keep the man at bay. James also made arrangements for Sarah and Lily to have a panic button app installed on their phones, giving them a direct line to the police if they ever felt threatened. It was a small comfort, but it helped ease the anxiety that had settled over them like a heavy fog. As the days turned into weeks, the tension gradually began to lift. The man didn't return, and the security measures James had put in place seemed to be working. Slowly, Lily began to regain her confidence, her laughter returning as she felt more secure in her surroundings. One evening, after tucking Lily into bed, James and Sarah sat together on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The air was cool, carrying with it the promise of a new season, a fresh start. "I think she's starting to feel safe again," Sarah said softly, her hand resting on James' knee. "You've done so much to protect us, James. I don't know how to thank you." James shook his head, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah. I'm just doing what I have to do, what any father would do." Sarah smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Not every father would go to these lengths. You've given her a sense of security she's never had before. And you've given me something I thought I'd lost a long time ago, hope." James turned to look at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "We've given each other hope," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "I've found something with you and Lily that I never thought I'd have. A family, a purpose, and I'm not going to let anything take that away from us." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their journey so far settling between them. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but they had made it through the worst. They had faced down their fears and come out stronger on the other side. As the night grew darker, they eventually made their way back inside, closing the balcony door behind them. The apartment felt warm and safe, a sanctuary from the world outside. James checked the locks one last time, out of habit more than necessity, before joining Sarah in bed. As he lay there, listening to the quiet sounds of the city and the soft breathing of the two people he loved most in the world, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. They were safe, they were together, and that was all that mattered. No matter what the future held, he knew they would face it as a family, and that gave him the strength to let go of the lingering fears and uncertainties. They had found their way through the darkness, and now they were stepping into the light. And in that light, they would build a future filled with love, security, and the unbreakable bonds of a family that had fought hard to stay together. The weeks that followed were marked by a gradual return to normalcy. The heightened sense of fear that had gripped James, Sarah, and Lily began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism. The man who had threatened their peace had not returned, and with each passing day, they grew more confident that he wouldn't. Yet, they knew it wasn't just the absence of danger that mattered. The real work lay in rebuilding the bonds that had been strained and tested. Lily, who had been shaken by the confrontation, was slowly regaining her joyful spirit. The once frequent nightmares were becoming less common, and her laughter was returning, a sound that filled the apartment with warmth and hope. James and Sarah both noticed the change, but they also understood that Lily still needed reassurance. Her world had been turned upside down more than once, and it would take time for her to fully trust in the stability they were trying to create. One Saturday morning, James decided it was time to do something special for Lily and Sarah, something that would help reinforce the sense of family they were building. He woke up early, made breakfast, and then proposed a day out, just the three of them, away from the city, to a place where they could relax and enjoy each other's company. "There's a park I used to go to when I was younger," James said as they sat around the kitchen table, the smell of pancakes and syrup filling the air. "It's got wide open spaces, a lake, and plenty of room to run around. I thought we could pack a picnic and spend the day there." Lily's eyes lit up at the idea. "Can we bring a kite? I've never flown a kite before." James smiled, his heart swelling at the sight of her excitement. "Absolutely. We'll pick one up on the way." Sarah reached across the table, squeezing James' hand. "That sounds perfect, James. We could all use a day like that." They spent the morning preparing for the outing, packing a basket with sandwiches, fruit, and treats. James could feel the energy in the apartment shift as they got ready. The tension that had hung over them for so long was slowly melting away, replaced by a lightness he hadn't felt in years. The drive to the park was filled with laughter and chatter. Lily, sitting in the back seat, talked nonstop about all the things she wanted to do. Fly the kite, explore the trails, maybe even dip her toes in the lake if it wasn't too cold. James listened with a smile, glancing over at Sarah, who was watching Lily with a contented expression. For the first time in a long time, things felt normal, better than normal. In fact, they felt right. When they arrived at the park, James was struck by how little it had changed since he'd last been there. The tall trees still lined the pathways, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, its surface smooth and inviting, and the wide open fields were perfect for running, playing, and of course, flying a kite. They found a quiet spot near the lake, spreading out a blanket and setting up their picnic. Lily wasted no time in unboxing the kite they had picked up on the way. It was brightly colored, with long tails that fluttered in the wind, and she could barely contain her excitement as James showed her how to get it ready for flight. "Okay, Lily, here's what you do," James explained, holding the kite while Lily stood a few feet away, gripping the string. "You're going to start running, and when I say so, you let go of the kite and keep running. The wind will do the rest." Lily nodded, her face a picture of concentration. "I'm ready." "All right," James said, feeling a thrill of excitement himself. "Go." Lily took off, her small legs pumping as fast as they could. James released the kite, and it soared into the air, its tail streaming behind it. Lily looked over her shoulder, her face breaking into a wide grin as she saw the kite climbing higher and higher. "It's flying, Dad. It's really flying," she shouted, her voice filled with pure joy. James jogged over to her, laughing as he watched her run with the kite string in her hands. Sarah joined them, clapping and cheering as Lily managed to keep the kite steady, guiding it with surprising skill for a first-timer. They spent hours at the park, playing games, exploring the trails, and simply enjoying the beauty of the day. They walked along the edge of the lake, their feet brushing against the cool water, and talked about everything and nothing at all. It was a day of simple pleasures, but for James, it was one of the most meaningful experiences he had ever had. Later, as the sun began to set, they returned to their picnic blanket, where they sat together, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. Lily leaned against James, her head resting on his shoulder, while Sarah sat close beside them, her hand entwined with James. This was the best day ever, Lily murmured sleepily, her eyes half closed. James kissed the top of her head, feeling an overwhelming sense of contentment. I'm glad you had fun, sweetheart. Sarah smiled at them, her heart full as she watched the two people she loved most in the world. We should do this more often, she said softly. Make it a tradition. James nodded, knowing that they had turned a corner. The fear and uncertainty that had once dominated their lives were giving way to something much better: hope, happiness, and the quiet joy of building a life together. As they packed up and headed back to the car, Lily's kite trailing behind them, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: a deep, unshakable peace. The darkness of the past had finally started to fade, and in its place, a brighter future was beginning to emerge. When they arrived home that evening, Lily went straight to bed, exhausted but happy. James and Sarah lingered in the living room, enjoying the quiet after a day filled with so much laughter and love. I think today was a turning point, Sarah said, leaning against James as they sat on the couch. We're finding our way back to each other, back to what really matters. James wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. We are. And I'm not going to let anything take that away from us. We've come too far. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. You've given us so much, James. You've given Lily the father she needed, and you've given me the hope I thought I'd lost. James kissed her softly, feeling the depth of their connection in that simple gesture. You've given me just as much, Sarah. We've given each other something real, something worth fighting for. They sat together in the quiet of their home, holding on to each other as the world outside faded away. The challenges they had faced were still there, but they no longer seemed insurmountable. They were a family, and they had proven that they could overcome anything as long as they stood together. As the night deepened, and they finally went to bed, James felt a sense of completion, as if all the pieces of his life were finally falling into place. They were building something beautiful, something lasting, and for the first time, he truly believed that they were going to be okay. They had faced the darkness and come out stronger, and now they were ready to embrace the light of their new beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the fragile peace that James, Sarah, and Lily had worked so hard to build began to feel more secure. The joy of their recent outing lingered in their hearts, and the apartment was once again filled with laughter and love. It seemed as though the worst was behind them, that the threats and shadows of the past had finally been banished. But just as they began to relax, to believe that they could move forward without looking back, the past came crashing back into their lives. It started with a phone call. James was at work, going over some documents, when his phone buzzed on the desk. The number was unknown, but something told him to answer. As soon as he heard the voice on the other end, his heart sank. "Mr. Carter," the voice said, cold and formal. "This is Detective Reynolds from the NYPD. We need to speak with you about a matter involving your family." James felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. "What is this about, Detective?" "It's about the man who showed up at your home a few weeks ago," the detective replied. "We've received information that he may be planning to come back. We believe he's a serious threat, and we need to take precautions." James' mind raced as the detective explained the situation. The man had been spotted near their apartment building multiple times, watching, waiting. He hadn't approached them yet, but it was clear he hadn't given up. The restraining order they had filed was in place, but that alone wouldn't stop him if he decided to act. "We're assigning an officer to keep an eye on your building," Detective Reynolds said, "but we recommend you take additional precautions. If there's anywhere else you can stay for a while, it might be safer." James felt a wave of anger and frustration rise within him. They had fought so hard to create a safe space for Lily, to give her a sense of stability and security, and now that was all being threatened again. But beneath the anger, there was also fear. Fear that this time, the man might not just be a distant threat. He might act. "Thank you, Detective," James said, his voice tight. "I'll take your advice." As he hung up the phone, James leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He needed to act quickly, to protect his family before it was too late. But more than anything, he needed to talk to Sarah, to figure out their next steps together. He left work early that day, his mind consumed with worry as he drove back to the apartment. When he walked through the door, Sarah immediately sensed that something was wrong. She was sitting at the kitchen table, going through some paperwork, but she put it aside as soon as she saw his expression. "James? What happened?" James took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady as he explained the situation. "The man, he's been watching the building. The police think he might try something. They've assigned an officer to keep an eye on us, but they recommended we stay somewhere else for a while, just to be safe." Sarah's face paled, her hand trembling as she reached out to him. "Oh my God. James, what are we going to do? Lily, she can't go through this again." "I know," James said, taking her hand and squeezing it reassuringly. "We'll figure this out. We can stay at my father's house for a while. It's further out of the city, and it's more secure. He offered it to us after our last visit, just in case. I didn't want to take him up on it, but now?" Sarah nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I hate this, James. I hate that we have to keep running, that we can't just live our lives in peace." James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I hate it too, Sarah, but we have to do what's best for Lily. We have to keep her safe, no matter what." They spent the next hour packing, their movements quick and efficient. They didn't want to alarm Lily, so they framed the sudden trip as a fun getaway to Grandpa's house. Lily was excited by the idea, her recent worries temporarily forgotten in the thrill of a new adventure. As they loaded up the car, James took one last look at the apartment building, a place that had become their home, their sanctuary. The thought of leaving it behind, even temporarily, filled him with a deep sense of sadness. But he knew they had no choice. They had to keep moving forward, to protect what they had fought so hard to build. The drive to his father's estate was quiet, the weight of the situation hanging over them like a dark cloud. Sarah reached over and took James' hand, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "We're going to be okay," she said softly. "We'll get through this." James nodded, squeezing her hand in return. "We will. We just have to stay strong. For Lily." When they arrived at the estate, James' father was waiting for them. He had taken the news seriously and had already made arrangements to increase security around the property. As they pulled up to the grand house, James felt a strange sense of relief. The estate was large and well protected, a place where they could finally catch their breath. Lily ran ahead, excited to explore the sprawling gardens, while James and Sarah unloaded the car. His father approached them, his expression grim but determined. "I've made sure everything is secure," he said, his voice low. "You're safe here. Stay as long as you need." James nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thank you. I wasn't sure we'd have to take you up on this, but I'm glad it's an option." His father placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a rare moment of comfort. "Your family, James. We'll get through this together." As they settled into the estate, the tension in the air began to ease, replaced by a tentative sense of security. Lily quickly adjusted to the new surroundings, delighting in the gardens and exploring every corner of the vast house. For her, it was an adventure, a temporary escape from the worries that had plagued her. But for James and Sarah, it was a time of reflection and planning. They spent long evenings discussing their options, considering what their next steps should be. James knew they couldn't stay at the estate forever, but he also knew they couldn't go back to their apartment until they were sure the threat was gone. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace, watching the sun set over the gardens, Sarah turned to James, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we should move? Find a new place, somewhere he won't know to look for us?" James considered her words, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "It might be the best option," he admitted, "but I don't want to uproot Lily again unless we have to. She's already been through so much." "I know," Sarah said, her voice filled with concern, "but I also don't want to live in fear. I want her to have a normal life, without constantly looking over her shoulder." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe it's time for a fresh start, somewhere new, where we can finally put all of this behind us." Sarah nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll find a new place, and we'll start over. Together." As they sat there, watching the sky turn from orange to deep blue, James felt a renewed sense of determination. They had faced so many challenges already, and they had come out stronger each time. This was just one more obstacle to overcome. "We'll get through this," James said, his voice steady. "And when we do, we'll build something even better. A new home, a new life, one where we can finally be at peace." Sarah smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I believe that, James. We've come too far to let anything tear us apart now." As the night deepened and the stars began to twinkle overhead, James felt a sense of calm wash over him. The past had returned to haunt them, but they weren't the same people they had been before. They were stronger now, more united, and together, they could face whatever the future held. They had been through darkness before, and each time, they had found their way back to the light. This time would be no different. And with that thought, James knew they were going to be okay. No matter what the past tried to throw at them, they would face it together. The decision to move marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. After weeks of searching, James and Sarah found a house in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city, a place where they could start fresh, away from the shadows of the past. It was a charming two-story home with a spacious yard and tall trees that offered privacy and a sense of peace. The moment they stepped inside, they knew it was the place where they could finally build the life they had been fighting for. The move itself was bittersweet. Packing up the apartment where they had shared so many memories wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Lily, ever resilient, embraced the change with her usual curiosity and excitement. She was eager to explore her new room, to pick out new paint colors, and to make the house truly feel like home. On the day of the move, James stood in the empty apartment one last time, letting the memories wash over him. This was where he had first brought Lily when she was lost and alone, where they had all begun to find each other. It was where he had become a father in more ways than one, and where he and Sarah had rebuilt their relationship from the ground up. But as much as this place meant to him, James knew that it was time to move on. "We're ready," Sarah said softly, coming up beside him. She slipped her hand into his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "It's time for a fresh start." James nodded, turning to look at her. "I know. This is the right thing for all of us." They closed the door on the apartment for the last time and headed to their new home. The drive was filled with a sense of anticipation, the weight of the past slowly lifting as they moved closer to their future. When they arrived, Lily ran ahead to explore the house, her laughter echoing through the empty rooms. "This is going to be great, Dad," she called out, her voice full of excitement. "I can't wait to decorate my room." James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him at the sight of his daughter so happy, so full of life. "We're going to make it exactly how you want it, Lily. This is your space, your home." The next few days were a whirlwind of unpacking, organizing, and settling in. James and Sarah worked side by side, transforming the house into a place that felt like theirs. They painted the walls, hung up pictures, and arranged the furniture just so. It wasn't long before the house began to feel like home, a safe, welcoming space where they could finally relax and enjoy the simple pleasures of life. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, they decided to take a break and have a family movie night. They piled onto the couch, Lily nestled between James and Sarah, a blanket draped over them. The movie played in the background, but James found himself more focused on the warmth and closeness of his family. This was what he had always wanted, this feeling of contentment, of belonging. As the movie ended, Lily fell asleep against James' side, her breathing soft and steady. James looked down at her, his heart swelling with love and pride. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling at how much she had grown, how far they had all come. "She's so happy here," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "We all are." James nodded, his eyes never leaving Lily. "This is where we're meant to be. We've been through so much, but we're stronger now because of it." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, sighing contentedly. "We've found our place, James, our home." The next morning, they woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside their window. The sun was shining, casting a golden light over the house. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel possible, like they were standing at the beginning of something beautiful. They spent the day outside, exploring their new neighborhood, meeting the neighbors, and discovering the local park where Lily would soon be spending many afternoons. The sense of community was immediate, and they were welcomed with open arms. It was exactly the kind of environment they had hoped for. A place where Lily could grow up feeling safe, loved, and supported. As the sun began to set, they returned home, tired but happy. They decided to have dinner on the back porch, where they could watch the sky turn shades of pink and orange. James grilled burgers while Sarah set the table, and Lily ran around the yard, playing with a ball she had found in the garage. When they finally sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and stories of the day. It was in these small, everyday moments that James found the most joy. Moments that reminded him of how far they had come and how much they had to look forward to. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one. Lily was curled up in Sarah's lap, her eyes heavy with sleep, but she was determined to stay awake as long as possible. "Can we do this every night?" she asked, her voice soft and drowsy. James smiled, reaching over to stroke her hair. "We can do this as often as you want, Lily. This is our home now. We can make our own traditions." Lily nodded, her eyes closing as she snuggled deeper into Sarah's arms. "I love it here," she murmured. "I love you, Dad. I love you, Mom." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked at James, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. This was what they had been fighting for, what they had dreamed of during the darkest moments. This feeling of peace, of love, of family. "We love you too, sweetheart," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. More than anything. As Lily drifted off to sleep, James and Sarah sat together in the quiet of the night, holding each other close. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing in the light of a new beginning. They had found their home, their safe haven, and they knew that no matter what challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. The past had tried to tear them apart, but instead, it had brought them closer, made them stronger. And as they sat there, watching the stars above, they knew that they had everything they needed to build a beautiful, happy life. One filled with love, laughter, and the unbreakable bonds of family. This was their new beginning, and they were ready to embrace it together. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting